So may I start with announcing just what I have to announce according to the due procedure. So the dissertation board for the PhD awarding procedure in economics is called to order to consider the dissertation submitted by Sergei Anuchin under the title Overcoming Economic Instability, the Role of Institution in the subject area 080001, Theory of Economics. So may I urge the audience to switch off their mobile devices. The defense is broadcast live online on St. Petersburg University website. Simultaneous interpretation into English is provided. Next, what I should say is that according to federal law, as of May 23, 2016, a revision of Provision 4 of the Federal Law on Science and Research Policy, St. Petersburg State University and Moscow State University have been granted an exceptional title to independently award scientific degrees hereby. Scientific degrees are awarded only in the subjects and scientific areas contained in the relevant scientific subjects register issued by the Russian Ministry of Education. A relevant resolution on the PhD awarding procedure in St. Petersburg State University is effective as of September 1, 2016, under the number 6821/1. The present meeting of the dissertation board is held in fulfillment of the resolution 3891/1 dated April 17, 2017. May I inform the audience that according to paragraph 17, section 3 on the rules of the PhD granting procedure in St. Petersburg State University, the dissertation board is not considered legitimate unless 2/3 or over of the appointed composition, but no less than 4 members are present at the meeting. Today the composition is 5 members. All the members are present. We can see and hear each other. The quorum is there. According to paragraph 19, section 4 on the dissertation board meeting of the aforementioned rules of procedure, the time limit of the meeting is as follows, and overall it should take no more than 120 minutes. The agenda is as follows: a brief report of the chair on the document submitted by the defendant in compliance with the requirements, a Q&A session to follow. Number 2, a brief report of the defendant on the findings of the research, 15 minutes maximum. Questions to the defendant's report, 2 minutes per question maximum, and defendant's replies. Presentation of the report submitted to the dissertation council. Members of the board take turns to announce their reports, focusing on elaborate argumentation behind their assessment. 5 minutes maximum, 5 general commentaries of the defendant addressed to the members of the board, 6 open discussion and statements by members of the audience who are not members of the board. Only strictly relevant suggestions, questions and feedback addressed to the defendant are accepted. 5 minutes per speaker. All willing to take the floor should register in the registration list beforehand. This registration list is at the first row of the audience room. 7. Defendants reply to statements of the audience who are not members of the dissertation board. 5 minutes maximum per question. Statement of the research supervisor, 3 minutes maximum. 9. 5 minutes break before open voting on awarding the defendant with the aspired academic degree, pass or fail. The discussion between members of the dissertation board is not broadcast online. 10. Open voting by name. Count of vote and registration of the voting results in the protocol. Pass or fail. 11. concluding statement by the defendant, 2 minutes maximum. So those are the key points in the agenda. And now, may I declare the agenda open? So number 1 is the short report of the chair on the documents presented by the defendant. So the dissertation by Sergei Anuchin, submitted in compliance with the requirements for the PhD in economics in the field economic theory, in the subject overcoming social and economic instability, the role of institution, was accepted for defense on April 17, 2017. The dissertation board was approved by a relevant resolution number 3630/1 as of April 13. The composition is as follows: Professor Ryazanov, Head of Economic Theory Department, St. Petersburg State University; Nadezhda Pakhomova, Doctor of Economics, Professor, Head of Economic Theory and Economic Education of St. Russian Pedagogical University; Dmitry Miropolsky, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor, Head of Economic Theory and Economic History Department, St. Petersburg State University; Pyotr Lemeshenko, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor, Head of Economic Theory and Institutional Economics, Belarusian State University, Minsk. The following documents were submitted by the defendant: the resolution by Rector Kropachev on acceptance of the dissertation; second, feedback from the scientific supervisor submitted by Professor Rumyantsev; third, list of research papers reflecting the key findings of the dissertation, including 5 papers in the journals registered with the Higher Attestation Commission; fourth, certificate proving that the defendant has successfully passed the following exams: Theory of Economics, History and Philosophy of Science in Economics, and Foreign Language, English. A copy of the diploma issued by St. Petersburg State University, number CA 07802, issued on July 6, 2012, qualifying Mr. Anuchin as economist. Fourth, dissertation in Russian and in English, both in hard and soft copy, drafted according to GOST requirements 7.0. I should note that all the above-mentioned documents comply with Provision 12, Section 3, presentation and defense of the dissertation according to the rule of defense awarding procedure in St. Petersburg State University. Any questions on the documents? If there are no questions, then we move on. And may I now turn it over to the defendant to inform us on the key findings of his research. Mr. Anuchin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear Chairperson, dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear colleagues, dear attendees, presented to your attention is the dissertation by Sergei Anuchin, Overcoming Socio-Economic Instabilities, Role of Institutions. In the past few years, the world is experiencing a rapid growth of instability foci, affecting different geographical reasons. However, economic aspects of instability are largely related to reasons and consequences of the global economic meltdown of 2008. The instability in the European Union and the slow down in the development of the Chinese economy are the most noticeable manifestations of the global crisis. Political instability in the world has increased considerably after the Arab Spring of 2011, which impacted on the socio-economic processes in the Middle East. The Islamic State, which has been active since 2014, caused socioeconomic instability in the areas controlled by it. All of these events caused the world economy to enter a complex and dangerous state. And the tensions experienced by it must be tackled, which represents one of the key theoretical and practical economic tasks faced by humanity. Our analysis brought us to the conclusions that the key economic and social aspects in the area are comparable to those experienced by the neighboring countries, which were not affected by instability. We chose to use the institutional apparatus methodology because it is far more capable of analyzing the features, causes, and consequences of instability. The institutions are the pivotal elements of the economic system that determine its functioning. The institutions in a social economic system protect the system from failures and ensure its sustainable functioning. This is one of the main challenges for the theory of economic instability. The goal of the dissertation is to analyze the impact of institutions on socioeconomic instability. And we were planning to develop a hypothesis of reciprocating succession of institutional interventions to stabilize unstable socioeconomic systems. To achieve the goal, we have outlined and fulfilled a number of objectives. The complete list of these objectives is presented on the slide. I'm going to focus on the main ones. The objectives include defining and analyzing the concept of socioeconomic stability, identifying its causes and manifestations, using the synergetic approach to the analysis of phenomena and processes, identify parameters and criteria for order and the driving factors in economy contributing to stabilization, to economic stabilization. Formulate the hypothesis on optimal transformation of unstable socioeconomic systems to make them stable whilst minimizing risks. The theoretical importance of our work is refining and deepening the methodological approach to analyzing unstable economic systems using the concept inventory of the economic theory. The hypothesis formulated as a result of our study supplements the concept, supplements and broadens our knowledge of consequences of economic instability. The practical importance consists in using the results to improve socioeconomic policies under the context of instability, in the context of instability. These can be used in isolation or holistically. The results, the findings of the dissertation can be used in teaching economic theory, comparative economics, and institutional economics. As a result of the study, the following conclusions were made. Number one, socioeconomic instability can be defined as a situation under which a national economy is incapable of developing sustainably in a mid and long-term interval, positively or neutrally, and the population of the country faces economic difficulties as well as social tension and growing contradictions between government and society. In the short-term perspective, instability may bring about structural economic crises, the growth of social and political tension. In the long-term perspective, it can undermine the strategic potential and the competitiveness of a country on the world arena and the helix-like degradation of the national institutional system. The self-organizing forces and socioeconomic instability that are defined as order parameters have a powerful impact on the institutional system. The order parameters must be duly coordinated in order to be effective. They can be coordinated with the help of governing or regulatory parameters that govern the transition of a system from one state to another. Of largest interest in this respect are the two drivers, or the two governing or regulatory parameters, the activity of state authorities, governmental authorities and agencies, and the system of goal setting of economic subjects in the national economic system. Institutional reforming is based on the socioeconomic genotype. The hypothesis related to overcoming socioeconomic instability through institutional change contributes to broadening the theoretical and practical methodology in terms of ensuring transition of economic systems and ensuring their stability. The order parameters must be augmented by by regulatory parameters and be gradually disseminated on the whole territory of the state. Socioeconomic stability makes it important to ensure reciprocating character of economic transitions and reforms. The transformation must not embrace the whole of the territory of the country. Several pilot areas must be identified from which reforms can be replicated to the remaining territories of the state. As a result of successful if implemented successfully, the theoretical model of institutional transformations suggested by the author can bring about stability in an unstable socioeconomic system while avoiding certain systemic events. The study of socioeconomic instability conducted as part of our dissertation enabled us to identify the mutual impact of instability and national institutional systems, as well as elaborate the methods for overcoming consequences of instability. Governmental institutions, as well as isolated companies and physical persons, must be involved in overcoming systemic mistakes. For developed regions of the world, the state of stability may seem natural, as well as for a healthy person, health seems an absolutely natural state of the of the body. However, many countries and regions, situations when socioeconomic systems function in a stable manner, are hard to reach objective, compared to which all the other objectives would seem secondary and insignificant. Stabilization of a national economic system cannot be ensured once and for good. After a while, the citizens' wishes may be directed to new objectives, and the achievements that have been made will seem absolutely natural, will be taken for granted. However, despite the changing evaluations, stabilization of a socioeconomic system ensures a fundamental basis for constructing all further achievements. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. I would like to give the floor to any attendees and members of the Dissertation Council who would like to ask questions. Yes, you're welcome. I have two questions, if you please. Number one, you have a very narrow field of study, destabilized economies of the Northern African region. To what extent are your conclusions applicable for other regions, like Russia, where the economic situation is not very stable, even though it is impacted by other factors? Can I ask another question? Yes. And my second question is as follows. Even though in your analysis you emphasize social institutions and national strategies, to what extent is the region that you studied impacted by the dynamics of cyclic economic development? To what extent was it present, and how did it impact the macroeconomic situation? Thank you very much. Would you like to answer to address the questions right now? Yes, if you please. Thank you for your questions. I would like to focus on the second question about the economic cycles at the very beginning. When my study was just conceived, I wanted to approach the topic from the macroeconomic point of view. At first, I studied the economic cycles based on Kitchin theory, Kondratiev theory. But the events in the Northern African region cannot be accounted for by macroeconomic situations alone. More often than not, the situation in the country were impacted by social factors, such as the segregation of large businesses from the ruling elites. So we weren't able to establish to what extent macroeconomic factors had a role to play in the situation. About your first question, we are focusing on countries facing economic instability. In our opinion, Russia doesn't fall into this category. We can talk of crisis or stagnation, but probably not instability, if you think about it from the institutional point of view. So it can hardly be regarded as a legitimate subject of our analysis. As for your question about the Middle Central Asian countries and the CIS, on the one hand, they form part of the X matrix, which was used in our study, but not Russia, perhaps. Thank you very much. Any more questions? More questions? Yes. Mr. Yaropolsky.
Well, in your research, you claim that you do not look into the internal reasons, internal roots of the Arab Spring, external roots of the Arab Spring. You are looking only at it internally. But what's your opinion as a researcher? What was primary, the external factors or the internal factors? And what was dominant? Thank you very much for the question. I believe that the roots should be internal. Most of them are related to the solidification of the senior elite, including Gaddafi. So without any options of changing powers and no rotation mechanisms, the youth slump also played its role. As for external factors, I believe that this was just a follow-up, including the strong support by mass media, the Western mass media, followed by the events in Egypt and the coup d'etat. So therefore, I believe that the synergies between the external and internal factors eventually gave these results. But the same stands true for Asia and Africa. The transition that we saw was due to Western support in terms of finance and mass media. Professor Inishenko, I have two questions. Well, the title of your topic is Overcoming Social and Economic Instability and the Role of Institutions. So, therefore, what is the role of institution, actually? And what institutions produce instability, right? Is that clear? What institutions produce instability? Your third chapter is very strong, and you cover lots of issues there. So your finding is just a hypothesis. Therefore, is it accurate speaking about a hypothesis of stabilization, economic stabilization? May I give you a hint? Well, your hypothesis is evidence-based, actually. So, do you reinforce or subvert it? Thank you so much. May I start with your second question about the hypothesis? Here, maybe I have misunderstood your question. My idea was that first I just phrase the hypothesis, and then in the following up paragraphs, I try to prove this hypothesis by looking at African countries. So there is a hypothesis, but there is an attempt to make this hypothesis evidence-based, to prove it. As for the first question, as for about the institutions that result in destabilization, well, here I can refer to the Arab Spring countries. So such institutions are large businesses. Let's have a look at Tunisia and Egypt. So this is what fueled tensions and fueled dissatisfaction among the public. And next, I can also refer to the rotation mechanisms. This is a key institution that ensures sustainability of the elite. If the elite follows one objective, has one route to follow, then this creates a momentum. However, if there is no future, if the elite has no vision, this results in its degradation, and then this makes the system of institution compromised. Professor Vasilenko, Sergei, you looked at social and economic instability, and you also suggest some tools to overcome this issue, but you referred to the macroeconomical dimension only. My question is, these theoretical results that you have produced, is it possible to apply them to other levels, for example, to microeconomy? I mean, these tools that you suggest, can they be applicable within a corporation, for example, but not a country? Thank you very much for the question. Well, I looked at the microeconomic analysis when it was a fresher, so I decided to expand these results into the macroeconomic analysis. As for corporations, I think that these tools are not applicable to a corporation because these tools are viable for a country where there are lots of shareholders, lots of parties in stake. So therefore, stability for all stakeholders and a tool to reinforce such stability cannot be transplanted onto a micro-business scale without any compromises. I have a question as well. Well, you look at the role of institutions in overcoming social and economic instability, and your key example is Arab countries, where religion is one of the key institutions. Therefore, my question, what is the stake of Islam in producing instability and in overcoming such instability? Thank you very much for this excellent question. Yes, indeed. This is one of the dimensions of my research, and these are my results. Islam, just as a tool to yield stability, is highly important because in a number of northern African countries, political parties were banned, I mean religious political parties. Therefore, Muslim brothers who played a very important role in Egypt and in Tunisia for quite a long time were banned as a party. And therefore, lots of opponents of Mubarak or Muhammad Ali joined these banned parties, these shadow parties. Those were the key opponents. They had very strong positions in the country, especially in Egypt, just because they improved medical services in rural areas as well as education, rural schools, and actually the economy of the country. Therefore, well, I didn't want to be too radical by saying that those are the forces behind the coup d'etat, behind the rallies, or by saying that they had such a strategy. But the very presence of these forces just opened a better vision for the population, introduced a better alternative to the present. Also, I should say that the huge difference between the rich and the poor generated discontent and opened up opportunities for a better life. However, in Egypt and in Tunisia, after the elections, representatives of Muslim parties came to power. Well, a case in point is Egypt, where he had the Muslim president who was later jailed. And the most share of the parliament was given to Muslims. But against that setback, unemployment grew rapidly, and actually they have not delivered on the anticipations of the population. And then a ban was introduced, banning religious parties in Tunisia and Egypt. Any more questions? No other questions? Okay. Now let's turn it over to members of the dissertation board. And our first speaker on the list, and I should say that if there are no objections, we will follow the list that I have, and therefore the first speaker is myself. Therefore, may I start with my report. Sergei, you may take your seat in the audience.
The problem of economic instability is a global one. Manifestations of instability display regional and national features. So in focusing a particular region, and let me remind you, our defendant focuses on the problem on the basis of Arab countries. It's very important, and it's a problem of a huge practical importance. This dissertation uses a theoretical approach based on the theory of economic instability and national institutions. This aspect of the problem is highly significant because the role of the institutions is a crucial one. I would like to point out that in terms of reliability of the findings and conclusions formulated in the dissertation, there aren't too many points that can be criticized. The findings were obtained on the basis of a large number of published sources, as well as correctly applied methodology. As far as the most important findings are concerned, I would like to list a few. Number one is the concept of instabilities, and is defined as a loss of predictability and sustainability of institutions. The defendant also identifies the fundamental role of institutions in overcoming systemic economic instability by impacting on its key trajectories. The defendant identified a number of institutional factors in socioeconomic instability, as well as identified certain strategies for overcoming it based on regulatory and basic fundamental parameters. Based on the theoretical approaches to overcoming instability, the defendant formulated and proves the hypothesis of the need in reciprocating progression of economic transitions, economic reforms. The dissertation also enables to systematize factors related to macroeconomic and socioeconomic instability. So the findings can be used in further studies as well as in the teaching activity. As far as the critical comments are concerned, I would like to focus on the following. 1. The work focuses on the qualitative characteristic of socioeconomic instability, such as the deformation of basic institutions, incapability of institutions for economic growth. Also, the defendant focuses on certain macroeconomic factors associated with socioeconomic stability. No threshold values for socioeconomic instability are suggested. The dissertation also outlines the author's ideas on disequilibrium and economic instability. However, it's not clear how this concept of disequilibrium is applied to economics. If it is unstable, does it mean that economic disequilibrium is inevitable or not? What are the differences between institutional and socioeconomic instability? The author also suggests economic reforms in certain selected pilot regions, economic zones, following with their replication to the other territories. Approbation, of course, is needed. However, there can be some limitations about this approach. Number 1, not all regions can be implemented regionally. Number 2, there is a risk in disintegration of the economic space and further economic gaps between the regions, as evidenced by the example of China. In analyzing the socioeconomic consequences of the Arab Spring, the author draws on the examples of Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt. However, the Arab Spring affected the economic systems of over 24 countries. It's not clear why these 3 states were selected. These questions and critical remarks do not undermine, do not subvert the value of the findings obtained as a result of the study. And I think that the defendant merits the PhD degree sought. I would like to give the floor now to my colleague, Nadezhda Pakhomskaya. Dear colleagues, part of the critical comments that have been articulated just now are the ones that I support. So I would like to say that the work does have practical and theoretical value. It's highly relevant in the present-day political and economic context. Unlike most publications that emphasize macroeconomic factors, the defendant has chosen to focus on institutional aspects and on institutional strategies, efficiencies, and failures of the institutions. And I think this makes an important contribution to the development of the institutional theory. As far as the subject of the dissertation is concerned, the defendant focuses on countries of Northern Africa. It's a very interesting region, one of the lesser studied in Russian economic science. And it's a highly instructive example for other regions. This determines the theoretical and practical significance of the work. The author formulated the goals and objectives of the study that are of high relevance. The methodology that the author uses is fairly comprehensive. The author draws from a large number of publications, including Anglophonic, and uses a wide variety of materials to support his statements. I would like to agree with Victor. It's a major contribution in the development of the categorical inventory of economic science, including the definitions of socioeconomic instability as a concept, as well as causes and manifestations, the wonderful analysis, the detailed analysis that the defendant has made. I was also interested in the typology of institutions described by the author. There are 3 types. Of them that enable to ensure economic strategy for overcoming economic instability. A very detailed elaboration of socioeconomic factors leading to overcoming instability. I quite liked the functions of the state and the state institutions in overcoming instability. They include coordination of the strategies, developing programs for, measures for establishing formal and informal norms in economy. I would like to disagree with Victor here, because I thought that identifying key regions or clusters is a very productive idea, because it's impossible to start reforming the whole of the country. Some pilot regions do need to be selected. This will help to mobilize forces, to motivate the people. As far as the theoretical and practical significance is concerned, the findings of the dissertation are useful for the teaching practice and as a basis for guidelines or recommendations for governmental authorities, not only in Northern Africa or the CIS countries, but for Russia as well. There are many interesting and useful analogies that can be drawn here. Some of the critical comments that I would like to make, I would say that the subject of the dissertation as being described by the author has been narrowed down. I would also like to recommend that the author introduce more clarity and segregate between disequilibrium and instability, because sometimes they're used synonymously and interchangeably, even though they shouldn't. The methods and methodology seem to emphasize general theoretical components. However, I think that the theory of economic evolution must be emphasized here, must be focused on here. the work centers on institutions and triggers or factors for economic destabilization. There is a good detailed classification of these. However, the author fails to mention a number of institutions used in a number of countries for this specific purpose, such as stabilization funds, reserve funds, that are geared towards compensating for these fluctuations and overcoming certain setbacks in economic progress. My next comment is related to quantification. In preparing this review, I studied some literature, and there are a number of publications where the quantification method is applied fairly widely. So some cutoff, some reference value is indeed necessary to be able to classify a particular economy as destabilized or remaining in a state of disequilibrium. However, the points and opinions on the subject differ, so I would like to offer the author of the dissertation to comment on his position, on his views. On the whole, I think that the dissertation is entirely consistent with the existing requirements, and that our defendant absolutely deserves the PhD degree sought in the subject field in question. I would like to give the floor to Professor Vasylenko.
The dissertation submitted by Sergei Onuchin is highly exciting because it brings together and offers solutions to two tasks that are closely related. On the one hand, the researcher looks into solutions for specific countries. On the other hand, he studies social and economic stability and instability in his understanding by solving two objectives. Well, I think it is only the defendant who knows all the way through to obtain these findings and the results that he has obtained. However, some theoretical knowledge is there which can be applied to various aspects. Not often do we see such success in PhD papers. I would like to support my colleagues in their statement that this topic is highly relevant, and I would like to name yet another factor that makes this topic ever more relevant, namely that the fact that the defendant looks into the global changes and into the processes behind the emerging of a global economy, which means that all countries are involved into these processes, thus determining the global success, the global economic success. I mean, against such setback, it is highly innovative by introducing tools to enhance this success by way of institutions. The method and the synergy tools developed by the author are highly innovative. I have never heard of synergies being referred to as a potential tool. So this coexistence of synergies and institutional tools allows to obtain such impressive findings. I very much appreciate the typology of institutions used to assess the changes and the degree to which the economic system is compromised, as well as this algorithm with institutional changes and transgressions, is also highly valuable. Overall, the value of this paper is displayed by the fact that we have specific tools for economic theory. We have specific parameters that are responsible for stabilization. Third, interaction of social and economic institutions and its mechanisms within stable and unstable environment. Fourth and fifth is the hypothesis of the institutional stabilization by way of theoretical modeling. A case in point is African countries and the Arab Spring. The reliability of the findings is ensured by the methods and is not compromised. The theoretical importance is that there is a hypothesis and specific proposals for stabilization and relevant events that enhance the overall concept, whereas practically these findings can be used in developing target public programs to stabilize social and economic systems amid crisis. However, there is a number of statements that fuels some further discussion and needs clarity. Some of them are as follows. The first chapter identifies the key parameters to measure social and economic instability. This, in turn, refers to some promising institutional factors. However, it is unclear whether these parameters echo the institutional parameters in the context referred. Second, institutional factors of economic instability and institutional deformities influence destabilization. And my question is, how does that influence? I mean, the behaviors of powers and the behavior of small and middle businesses. Third, the third chapter looks at stabilization policies. How solid is this algorithm? Does it allow any changes, any modifications? Is it open to any redrafting or not? And fourth, the reform strategy for unstable economies that were destabilized as a result of the Arab Spring and these measures. And my question refers to this dimension. To what degree are those evidence-based? How does it reflect the peculiarity of institutions? National institutions, I mean. And could these results be extrapolated to other national economies? Despite all of these inaccuracies and unclarities, the paper is still solid, comprehensive, is in full compliance with the requirements for PhD degree papers. Therefore, I should say that the research is in full compliance with the PhD awarding procedure in St. Petersburg State University, and Mr. Anuchin deserves the aspired scientific degree. Thank you so much. May I now give the floor to Professor Mira Polsky. Distinguished colleagues, I would like to add a couple of words to the relevance of this paper. Contemporary economic theory looks at developed market economies, whereas poorly developed economies remain beyond its scope. Therefore, this integral approach offered in this paper is highly relevant. As for the conclusions and recommendations, those are very well evidence-based. However, in some way, those are compromised as well. The research offers a number of classifications, and I see that classifications are Mr. Mnuchin's love indeed. But the drivers of these classifications and the factors behind them are an open question and are yet unclear. I should say that all the findings are evidence-based and they are reliable because there are lots of references and lots of examples, practical examples. As for the novelty of the research, the instability results in this split of the system into the well-organized one and the poorly organized one. Instability develops in two cases. First, when the existing institutions impede its development, and second, when a system could be stable, provided that there were relevant institutions in place. The author identifies the great parameters and the key driving parameters, and this is actually the foundation of Mr. Mnuchin's logics and his destabilization program with the stepwise and forth and back pattern of development. As a practical background, Mr. Mnuchin looks as the Arab Spring countries, which makes this paper really innovative because these events that have not yet been analyzed, so Mr. Mnuchin has tapped the potential of these events, the practical economic potential, and looks into the reasons of destabilization which are related to absence of power. However, together with novelties, there are some compromises. These great parameters are identified as institutional factors or institutions, if I have it rightly. But this also includes the infrastructure, which means that there is the water supply system, the drainage system. These are institutions as well, aren't those? So what is an institution? Is it just an area within a country's economy? If institutions are everything, then we should not identify those as something separate. Those are just the fabric of the society. Second, it's not clear what is the ultimate reason of institutional transformations. Well, the defendant refers to mentality, but mentality is just the result of an X or an Y matrix. So this is unclear. Third, there are two global institutions. This is a key division of the entire institutional setup of the society, but this is presented vaguely in the research. Some of these institutions belong to the X matrix. This is the Asian production pattern, etc. However, the key conclusions are not clear. What institutions are the driving forces of economic stabilization? Including the situation in Egypt or in Tunisia. And lastly, the way the novelty of the research is phrased is a little bit frustrating because the author refers to institutional stabilities by analyzing the stabilization processes. Nevertheless, the institutional analysis and the research methods are not the reasons behind stabilization of the economic system. I think that the phrasing is impaired here, and it requires editing or some clarification. Overall, all these statements do not impair the overall impression, and the dissertation is in full compliance with the PhD awarding procedure in economics. Thank you. May I now give the floor to Professor Lemeshenko.
Dear colleagues, I would like to draw your attention to a number of other aspects related to the relevance of the subject. Of course, it's a PhD dissertation, and it must be consistent with PhD requirements. However, and the comments that my colleagues have made are, of course, relevant, but in terms of the level, in terms of the depth of the study, the work is highly relevant, even so over 25 years have passed. The transition period is still going on. There have been publications that Belarus has not there are discussions that the transition period in Belarus is over, but that's a contestable issue. So as far as economic transition is concerned, this is an area that is widely discussed by the whole of the world globally. Institutions reflect our ideas about economic reality. So the comments that I would like to make are, on the one hand, related to the focus of the dissertation, not so much to the focus of the dissertation or to the overall hypothesis, but to a number of secondary aspects. The global crisis that is being described in the work is related to issues of stability and instability outlined in the dissertation. All the countries, and Russia is no exception, define their own strategies for development. How do they do that? Through peaceful coexistence and coordination of interests, or individually? Another question is the degree of uncertainty which has grown on the economic level and on the level of political elites. So the work is highly relevant in terms of the scale, in terms of the scope. The findings are absolutely consistent with the overall goal of the work. The author has approached his objectives creatively. He analyzes many sources of factual information, applying theoretical and general or specific methods, using a lot of empirical material. The structure of the work is very logical and consistent with the objectives outlined in the dissertation. As for the contribution to knowledge, Sergei has been able to merge the conceptual inventory of synergy and institutional economics. When you were talking about attractors and factors that are less changeable, they can be described as objective economic laws, objective laws of economics. The part of the population that tries to destabilize the national economy must understand that there are different thrust areas in terms of destabilization. The innovative aspects of the work include the classification and structuring of institutions. The author does have a very logical approach to this area, and a highly effective one. I would like to add that despite the fact that the author quotes the authors of the theory of the X matrix, he introduces his own contributions to the X matrix. I think it's a highly positive feature that the author, unconsciously maybe, supplemented the X matrix with his own contributions of high theoretical approach, of high theoretical significance. The author takes a very weighted approach to institutional change, outlining possibilities for universal transformations and specific transformations, focusing on the economic and social genotype, which can serve as an anchor regulating institutional change. The structure of the dissertation and the presentation and the layout are in total compliance with existing requirements. The style is acceptable, as is the volume and the number of sources. As far as critical comments are concerned, several could be identified. The study focuses on the endogenous factors of instability, even though in reality many of the factors are exogenous and they are of critical importance for the growth of socioeconomic instability. My second comment. In Chapter 2, the author almost completely excludes synergetic analysis. Given the major role of the systems theory in his work, it wasn't a very rational decision. As you know, a major role is played by the religious factor plays a major role in the economic development in the region. I would like you to focus more on this issue. The criteria for stability and instability, apart from the qualitative factors, need to be supplemented with quantitative factors. However, the critical comments, my critical remarks are debatable and do not invalidate the findings obtained by Mr. Onuchin, whose work contains highly reliable conclusions, original and innovative, in view of which the author can be deemed as meriting the PhD in the chosen subject field, economic theory. I would like to give you the floor, Mr. Onuchin, to respond to the remarks, to the critical remarks.
Thank you very much for the feedback and highly exciting commentaries. May I clarify how much time do I have? What's my time limit? Well, the more the better, actually. Well, let's start with 15 minutes. This is the maximum according to the procedure. Well, some of the critical remarks are reiterating, therefore I decided to join them into 3 blocks, and I will view all of them, will cover all of them. And I'm going to refer to the commentaries in the order that the members of the board submitted their reports. The first group of critical remarks refers to how stability and not stability refer to each other. The second part is the institutions and the great parameters. And third, the qualitative and quantitative factors in assessing the degree of instability. As for instability and stability and indeterminateness referred by Madam Pakhomova, some of these parameters are used as synonyms. Imbalance, inarticulate nature are indeed synonymous, but they reflect some specific aspects. As for the indeterminate feature, this is the degree of information, the degree of our knowledge. This is the amount of information that is vested in a system. Information is symmetric in any economic system. Therefore, it is never entirely determinate. However, there is some threshold value, some limit. And when it is trespassed, then the functions of the system are impaired. And this is determined, this threshold value is determined by the degree of non-determinedness. As an example, the unpredictability of markets results in in information coming with some jet lag. Another example is bankruptcy of a company. In this case, the key criteria is not the accumulation of systemic mistakes, but the general panics. As for the imbalance, I believe that economy is a system which is in dynamic equilibrium. Imbalance of this equilibrium results in accumulation of capital and imbalance in the accumulation of capital. Therefore, the disproportionate production of the overall product is just a routine state of an economic system. This does not mean that the system is in crisis, but this is one of the factors that may trigger a crisis or a crisis process. Therefore, profits can be imbalanced, and then the overall system is disbalanced. One of the forms of this scenario is the disproportion of the capital. This is one of the reasons behind the 2008-2009 crisis. Another reason is the imbalances in demand. And this results in a slump in prices and the invalidation of resources. As for how these two notions refer to instability, at some stage, all of them result in instability. Indeterminate systems would drive the entities beyond the scope of stability. So this is my answer to this question, actually. As for the second set of questions, referring to the great parameters and the institution parameters, the order parameters, an institution is formal and a non-formal conduct within a society that coordinates economic systems and ensures their function. As for the order parameters, those are the key functional links within an economic structure that identify its qualitative parameters. Those are the drivers behind any national economic development, and they are highly promising. However, a factor here is just a driver that identifies the process overall. Therefore, in this context, those are drivers that identify the national system. Therefore, I'm not saying that the institutional parameters and the order parameters are the same things, but they are definitely interrelated. As for the technological development, here I mean freedom of institutions to develop. Those set the rules of the game. Here I did not mean the technologies themselves, but I mean the management structures that have been established and that are key to any fundamental economy. Technological development is a system of interactions. So I indeed agree that I should have been more clear here. And the third set of questions refer to qualitative and quantitative parameters. So several members of the board asked this question. And yes, indeed. Do you hear me? The third chapter that looks into North African countries includes several parameters: violation of civil rights, unemployment, so on and so forth. However, Northern African countries are well advanced than their neighboring countries. So if we look at the fragile index, what we see is that in Libya and in Tunisia, these indices were better. However, these countries did not suffer any revolutions. I mean, countries like Sudan. These countries were well advanced than Saudi Arabia. As for the quality of life, they are very well back. They are in the second half of the list, but not the very end of the list. As a conclusion, I can say that the civil war in Libya and in Egypt display that these parameters are not very much different from the countries which have not suffered any crisis. And this allows us to assess stability in qualitative terms. So these violations accumulate mistakes, resulting in destabilization. But we cannot exclude the quantitative parameters out of our scope. Indeed, and I promise I will refer to them in my further research. Those are the key three groups of questions. And then I'm going to follow the commentaries that are remained. As for the differentiation of regions, and therefore the example of China, and the cases when specific economic zones resulted in the economic differentiation. And there was another commentary, I'm sorry. I mean, the very fact that reforms can be regional. Yes, indeed. We can be aware of that. But in this very program, in this very policy, I decided to tailor the parameters so as to avoid such a challenge. So therefore, I avoided looking into such parameters as public authorities. As for differentiation of regions, for example, in China, well, this program is very much similar to the Chinese scenario, with most prospective regions being on the front line, being among the priority ones. Once good values are achieved there in terms of employment, in terms of average payroll, then these measures are extrapolated onto other areas. But China is a large country in terms of territory and its economy. It has huge advantages. One of them is that this program was successful before the world crisis started to unfold. Over 6 years, regional GDP stood at approximately 10%. From 2010 from 2000 to 2005, the overall GDP grew 2.5-fold. This successful development was stopped by a world crisis. Therefore, I believe the world crisis is one of the key reasons that allows us to state that this agenda was successful, but it failed due to the crisis. Second, what makes China different is the large territory and large infrastructural costs. For example, in Western areas, these costs are higher than in coastal areas. However, this can be differently in other countries. And lastly, in China, one of the drivers behind the development was low payroll, whereas in regions where the payroll was advantageous, there we should not expect its growth. So I think we also have to stipulate whether this is an important parameter or not. On the other hand, there are ample examples of specific economic areas in the world, in Mexico, Singapore, South Korea, where we see that the payroll is the key driver of the economy. In Mauritania and in Algeria, for example, are the countries that are top 4 among the most rapidly developing economic areas. There, the increase of payroll saved these regions and just stopped the further stagnation. So therefore, it is indeed a challenge, but it can be solved. As for the next question on the selection of these countries,
first of all, the countries were selected due to the fact that they experienced a complete change in the regimes. The Arab Spring had a major impact on the governmental authorities. In Egypt, this concerns the Mubarak regime. In other countries, like Bahrain or Yemen or Morocco, even Syria, displayed major instability processes. They were affected by civil wars, but no change of elites occurred. No change of elites occurred in these countries. So this. So the could you please be brief? Yes. The countries were selected because of the change of elites. As far as the applicability of the findings to Russia is concerned, Middle Asia do experience economic instability, and they are consistent with the definition of the X matrix. However, I'm not very familiar with the Central Asia countries. I do think that my findings could be, with some adjustments, applicable to the Central Asian district. I would like to focus on questions by Nadezhda Pakhomova now, Dr. Nadezhda Pakhomova. Why did I select institutions as the object of my dissertation? Because the system is a group of elements, a collection of elements. And I wanted to accentuate the role of individual institutions rather than the added value offered by all the institutions collectively. The second question concerned the methods. And I do believe, yes, I should have described the methodology more clearly in the introductory part of the thesis. The next question concerned the indices and insufficient attention to quantitative factors, but I think I have already addressed this question before. The next reviewer focused on institutional parameters. I think I answered this question before. As far as the opportunistic behavior is concerned, I would like to mention that the key factor bringing about instability of the system and exacerbating contradictions within the system is the lack of trust in counter-agents and governmental authorities. And this was experienced in Sudan, for example, where a law was adopted prohibiting the export of capitals abroad. Part of the countries managed to take the capitals outside the country, part didn't. However, these factors largely impact the system that is unstable already, because in very general cases, the asymmetric information is a risk that is present in an economy, but in stable economies, asymmetric information may bring about a low level of trust in companies, in suppliers, which means that the supply chain uses one and the same contractors. Opportunistic behavior results in the lack of balance between donors and the state supporting systems. So the recipients do not get enough funding to stabilize their economic operation. The next question concerned the order, the procedures for transformations. So the main thing is to observe the succession of order parameters, ensuring stability of the system, and the factors ensuring resource management. However, reciprocating movement is possible. And that means that the system would sometimes go back to the stage that was stabilized previously. My last question referred applicability to other regions, like Middle Asia, Central Asia. Given the local mentality and the national economic systems, the program is applicable to all economic systems that function within the X matrix. So the first commentary is by Dmitry Miropolsky about the root causes of instability and the theoretical principles that these root causes are based on. I proceeded from the premise about the exacerbated controversies between the different components of the system, such as institutions and goals of economic agents. In my work, I proceed from the premise that governing parameters sometimes become incapable of controlling processes. And accumulation of errors committed in this way, in this matter, contributes to instability, which we saw in Northern Africa. The elites and the population interacted in such a way as to ensure societal stability. However, when the elites disintegrated, instability ensued. The next question was about planning and market forces in economy. We did not classify our institutions based on this criterion. However, overcoming instability is impossible without planning institutions. And one example is the policy of the Egyptian Prime Minister. The main success that he made in economic policy, unlike his predecessors, was a high presence of the state in economy and the dependence on international funding provided in exchange for governmental intervention in economy, which would have been impossible under market conditions. One example is that at present Egyptian economy is developing through mega projects such as the extension, the broadening of the Suez Canal, development of mining enterprises around in the Red Sea area, and large-scale programs for residential dwellings procurement for low-income population groups. This testifies to the fact that the government is oriented at rigid regulation of economy. As far as the scientific relevance of my dissertation is concerned, of course, I didn't mean stabilization by means of institutional analysis, but I wanted to substantiate the hypothesis for economic stabilization based on economic and social institutions. Finally, the last review concerned exogenous and endogenous factors. Exogenous factors involve politics, which is why I decided not to include it in my study. In my opinion, it's endogenous factors that form the foundation for stability, rather than exogenous. It would have been impossible to stabilize Northern African economies in the absence of factors favoring stabilization. I did not want to extend the subject, to formulate the subject of the work too broadly. As far as the synergetic components of the work are concerned, my work proceeds from the systems theory, developing into institutional analysis of economy. In Chapter 3, on the basis of order factors, I built a chain of transitions and reforms. I also considered the changes in the state system and the way it is impacted by instability. So systems theory was fairly sufficient and effective in explaining this process. Informal institutions. I think I have touched upon this problem earlier. As far as the impact of Islam is concerned, Islam in Northern African countries plays a less important role compared to, say, Saudi Arabia and Yemen. In Tunisia, the legislation is 100% secular. Talking about Islamic banks in Egypt, they do not account for, they account for 15% of the total banking system maximum. So, in order not to reiterate what I said before, the Islamic factor, of course, played a major factor in destabilization, because the population saw Islam and religious forces as a real alternative to the effective government. However, when these forces came to power, the population was quickly disappointed in them, which is why the forces lost popularity. As far as criteria for instability are concerned and the quantitative evaluations, notably, I think I have addressed this question before. Yes, thank you very much. You can be seated now. And this concludes the public discussion of the dissertation. And I would like to address the audience whether any of the attendees would like to comment. After no more comments, I would like to give the floor to the scientific advisor, to the research supervisor.
Distinguished members of the dissertation board, in my report, I just reflected the contents of Sergei's research, so now I would like to address its relevance. I believe that instability is accumulated in every economic system, whatever the country it is, whatever the region. So this is just strategically relevant. If economics of the 20th century was the economics of balance, so now we are presented with the economics of imbalance, and we know all too well that imbalance is a pathway to the future balance, but instability factors are starting to top the agenda today. So we believe that all the economists and scientists have to be aware of these factors. And now we have economics of instability as a fundamental science today. Therefore, this makes Mr. Onuchin's research highly relevant. This is a pilot research in this respect indeed, which makes it, on the one hand, so strong, but on the other hand, it adds to its fragility. As for our joint work together, we were just... this brings together two key aspects. On the other hand, it was a highly meticulous work and a thorough one. Sergei has a very compromised history, actually. There's a compromised background. He had to change his supervisor, and it was indeed a challenging story. So Sergei was able to step up to a number of challenges due to his flexibility, his desire to communicate. I believe that Sergei has successfully presented a decent paper and defended it very decently. Therefore, I believe that his paper is in compliance with all the requirements. Thank you very much. So we have finished the discussion, and now may I announce a break. Please switch off the broadcasting, and I urge everyone to leave the room, and only members of the dissertation board are allowed to stay. Thank you. Okay, we can switch on the broadcasting. Do you hear me? Okay. Then I have to announce the resolution of the dissertation board following the joint discussion on Mr. Mnuchin's dissertation, and the resolution is as follows. To grant Sergei Mnuchin with the aspired degree of PhD in 080001 Theory of Economics. No objections. Decided jointly. If there are no questions, may I congratulate Mr. Mnuchin with this resolution. It is passed. Mr. Mnuchin, your concluding remarks. Well, thank you very much. May I extend my gratitude to all members of the dissertation board for their time, for their effort, for reading so thoroughly my dissertation. These 5 years were indeed a long way, quite a challenging way. Therefore, thank you so much for your attention, for so exciting questions. So my passionate gratitude is with you. I also extend my gratitude to my research supervisor, who was always there. He is just an ideal research supervisor. And of course, my specific gratitude to my first research supervisor, who has been always there when I was a student at the university, and who actually offered this topic to me. This was his idea initially. As for the procedure, well, I should say that it was indeed a long way, because the dissertation board was closed first. But it is my pleasure to have it here in St. Petersburg State University, as well as the very fact that it is translated and interpreted into English. That is a huge pleasure for me to be on such a global arena. Once again, thank you so much. I extend my gratitude to members of the board for their contribution. Thank you.